If the spiral is truly a description of how consciousness unfolds, then it is natural for the mind to eventually ask whether that unfolding is the whole of reality or only one expression of something even greater. The question itself does not arise because the spiral has failed. It arises because every structure, no matter how vast, eventually produces awareness capable of looking beyond the structure that formed it. A child eventually asks about the house. A civilization eventually asks about the planet. And consciousness eventually asks about the architecture that has carried it this far. Many people assume that asking what exists outside the spiral somehow weakens the spiral. It does not. The question actually demonstrates the spiral's success. A system that can produce beings capable of questioning the limits of the system has reached an extraordinary level of maturity. Curiosity at this depth is not rebellion against understanding. It is one of understanding's natural consequences. Notice how often the mind imagines outside, as though existence were surrounded by empty space. We inherit this habit from living inside physical environments. Everything we know has edges, boundaries, containers, horizons, and distances. We naturally project those experiences onto reality itself until we begin imagining consciousness as though it were another object floating somewhere inside an unimaginably larger room. But consciousness has never actually presented itself that way. Awareness does not encounter itself by walking across distance. It encounters itself through distinction. A new realization is not reached by traveling miles. It is reached when a different relationship becomes possible. This alone should make us cautious whenever we imagine outside in purely spatial terms. Perhaps outside does not mean elsewhere. Perhaps outside means beyond the assumptions that made the current architecture visible in the first place. Every map contains directions while simultaneously hiding everything that cannot be described using its own symbols. A map of rivers cannot explain music. A map of language cannot explain gravity. The limitation is not because rivers reject music or because language rejects gravity. Each map faithfully represents what it was designed to reveal while remaining almost completely silent about realities organized by different principles. The spiral may function in much the same way. It may faithfully describe one immense mode through which consciousness organizes experience without claiming to describe every possible mode available to existence itself. This possibility should not frighten us because every meaningful discovery in human history has expanded rather than destroyed the truths that came before it. Understanding becomes larger not by erasing previous insight, but by placing it into wider context. Imagine discovering an ocean after believing only rivers existed. Rivers would not become false. Their currents would still flow exactly as they always had. Yet suddenly their destination would be understood differently. What once appeared complete would now appear connected. The river had never been isolated. Our understanding had been. The same pattern repeats throughout human experience. We once believed villages contained the world until continents expanded our perspective. Then planets replaced continents as our primary horizon. Later, galaxies replaced planets. Every expansion required humility because each revealed that certainty had quietly mistaken its own horizon for the horizon itself. The spiral itself encourages this humility. Growth is never merely accumulating answers. Growth also involves becoming capable of carrying questions that cannot yet be resolved. There is a profound difference between ignorance that refuses to inquire and wisdom that recognizes the depth of what remains unseen. One closes possibility, the other protects it. This is why some questions should not be answered too quickly. A premature answer often satisfies anxiety more effectively than it serves truth. We have all experienced moments when certainty felt comforting simply because uncertainty felt uncomfortable. Yet the comfort was temporary because reality eventually became larger than the explanation we had accepted. We did not suffer because reality expanded. We suffered because our certainty refused to expand with it. If there are architectures beyond the spiral, they cannot simply be added like another chapter to an already finished book. They would likely require entirely different ways of perceiving. New realities often demand new capacities before they become visible. The eye cannot hear music. The ear cannot see color. Each faculty reveals what it has been shaped to receive. Perhaps consciousness develops in a similar manner. Every expansion creates capacities that were previously impossible, not because reality changed, but because perception itself matured. Entire dimensions of meaning may already coexist with us while remaining invisible simply because our present organization cannot yet participate in them. This does not imply hidden supernatural worlds waiting behind a curtain. It points toward the ordinary observation that possibility consistently exceeds current perception. Think about how often this has already happened in your own life. Conversations you once could not understand later became obvious. Books that seemed confusing suddenly felt simple years later. Experiences that once appeared meaningless gradually revealed incredible depth. The information was often present from the beginning. What changed was not the information. What changed was you. If consciousness can transform so dramatically within one human lifetime, why assume evolution eventually reaches a final architecture? Why believe that growth suddenly stops simply because our imagination has reached its present limit? The boundary of imagination has repeatedly mistaken itself for the boundary of reality throughout history. Each generation eventually discovers that existence remained patient while understanding slowly caught up. There is another possibility worth considering. What if asking what exists outside the spiral already belongs to the spiral? What if the architecture naturally generates observers who eventually question the architecture itself because self transcendence is one of its defining characteristics? In that case, the question is not evidence that we have escaped the spiral. It may be evidence that we have reached one of its deepest movements. The spiral, then, would not be a prison of ideas, but an engine of continual expansion. Every apparent ending would quietly prepare another beginning. Every completed understanding would become fertile ground for a larger one. Every certainty would eventually mature into a better question rather than a permanent conclusion. Growth would no longer be measured by the number of answers collected, but by the increasing capacity to remain open without becoming lost. Yet even this possibility should not become another certainty. The mind is remarkably skilled at transforming living questions into fixed doctrines. It wants stability. It wants finality. It wants somewhere permanent to stand. But reality has repeatedly invited consciousness not merely to stand, but to participate. Participation asks something different than certainty. It asks attentiveness, flexibility, patience, and the willingness to discover that today's horizon may become tomorrow's first step. So when we ask what exists outside the spiral, we may unknowingly be asking several different questions at once. We may be asking whether consciousness has a final destination. We may be asking whether reality contains other organizing principles beyond those we currently recognize. We may even be asking whether existence itself is still unfolding in ways that no civilization, no teacher, no philosophy, and no language has yet become capable of describing. The question appears simple, but the deeper we remain with it, the more we begin to notice that it is quietly reshaping the one who asks it before it ever reveals what the answer might be. One possibility deserves far more attention than it usually receives. We often imagine that if there are realities beyond the spiral, they must somehow be larger versions of the spiral itself. We extend the familiar rather than questioning the familiar. Yet, reality has repeatedly surprised consciousness by introducing entirely new principles rather than merely expanding old ones. The new horizon has often required not a bigger map, but a different way of mapping altogether. This is difficult for the mind because the mind learns through continuity. It wants every new discovery to resemble what came before so that it can comfortably place it into an existing category. When something refuses categorization, we often mistake our confusion for evidence that it cannot exist. History shows the opposite. Some of the most transformative discoveries first appeared impossible because no framework yet existed that could receive them. If there are architectures beyond the spiral, we should not expect them to be recognizable from where we stand today. We may lack not only the language to describe them, but the cognitive relationships required to perceive them. This is not a statement about intelligence. It is a statement about organization. Different forms of organization reveal different aspects of reality without implying superiority over one another. Consider how color exists independently of whether a creature possesses eyes capable of detecting it. A being without vision would not live inside a false universe. It would simply inhabit a different relationship with the same reality. The colors would not be hidden. They would be unavailable through the structure of that being's perception. This distinction matters because it shifts the question away from hidden places and toward hidden capacities. Perhaps every architecture is less like a location and more like a way of relating to existence. The spiral would then represent one magnificent relationship through which consciousness discovers itself. Another architecture, if one exists, might not replace this relationship. It might illuminate dimensions that the spiral was never intended to organize. Both could remain true without becoming competitors. Human thought often creates unnecessary competitions between ideas. If one explanation appears valuable, another must somehow be defeated. If one perspective survives, another must disappear. Yet nature rarely behaves this way. Light behaves as both wave and particle depending upon the relationship being examined. Organisms function simultaneously as individuals and ecosystems. Reality repeatedly demonstrates that apparent contradictions often become complementary when viewed from a wider perspective. The same humility may be necessary here. Asking whether the spiral is one architecture among many does not require diminishing the spiral. It requires releasing the assumption that completeness always means exclusivity. Something can be profoundly foundational without being absolutely exhaustive. A language may express extraordinary beauty while remaining one language among countless others capable of expressing beauty differently. This possibility also changes how we understand evolution itself. We often imagine evolution as climbing toward completion, as though consciousness were assembling the final version of itself piece by piece. But what if evolution is better understood as increasing relational freedom? Every stage would then grant access to more ways of participating with reality rather than bringing consciousness closer to some permanent endpoint. Growth would become multiplication rather than conclusion. Notice how this already appears in ordinary life. As children, our emotional world is relatively narrow because our relationships are relatively simple. Over time, we do not merely collect more emotions. We develop more nuanced ways of relating to love, grief, responsibility, creativity, silence, beauty, and uncertainty. Reality has not become larger in an objective sense. Our capacity to enter different relationship with it has expanded. Perhaps consciousness evolves in exactly this manner across scales we cannot yet imagine. Every expansion increases available relationships without exhausting reality itself. Every breakthrough opens additional forms of participation that were previously inaccessible. The destination keeps receding because the purpose was never arrival. The purpose was increasing richness of participation. This perspective also changes how we think about source. If source is infinitely generative rather than merely infinitely large, then creativity itself becomes fundamental. New architectures would not represent corrections to earlier ones. They would express an inexhaustible capacity for reality to know itself through genuinely distinct modes of organization. Diversity would no longer appear accidental. It would become intrinsic to the nature of existence. This may explain why consciousness seems drawn toward novelty throughout every level of experience. Children explore, scientists investigate, artists experiment, civilizations innovate. Even after achieving stability, something quietly urges awareness toward undiscovered possibilities. We often interpret this as restlessness, yet perhaps it reflects something far deeper. Perhaps reality continually expresses its own inexhaustibility through the curiosity embedded within conscious beings. The question then becomes less about escaping the spiral and more about understanding what the spiral prepares consciousness to become. Every authentic educational system eventually produces students capable of asking questions the curriculum never explicitly answered. This does not indicate failure, it indicates readiness. The greatest teachers do not create permanent dependence upon themselves, they cultivate the capacity for independent discovery. If the spiral possesses this quality, then one of its highest expressions may not be certainty but intellectual generosity. Consciousness begins allowing possibilities to exist before possessing the ability to confirm them. It learns to distinguish openness from gullibility, humility from indecision, confidence from rigidity. These are subtle distinctions, yet they profoundly shape the quality of inquiry. A mind that already knows cannot discover very much. A mind willing to observe carefully becomes available to realities that certainty would have rejected. There is also a practical consequence to carrying this question well. Daily life begins changing. Conversations become less about winning conclusions and more about refining perception. Learning becomes less about collecting beliefs and more about becoming someone capable of seeing what was previously invisible. Even disagreement changes because every encounter becomes an opportunity to discover whether another perspective reveals relationships we have not yet recognized. This does not mean every new idea deserves acceptance. Discernment remains essential, but discernment is not the same as immediate dismissal. It is the patient discipline of allowing observation to mature before judgment becomes fixed. The more expansive consciousness becomes, the more comfortable it grows with allowing questions to remain alive without rushing them into premature certainty. Perhaps this is the deeper preparation hidden inside the question itself. Before consciousness can encounter whatever may lie beyond its present architecture, it must first become the kind of consciousness that can meet the unknown without immediately reducing it to the familiar. The greatest threshold may never have been between one reality and another. It may exist between the impulse to possess understanding and the willingness to continually be transformed by it. And if that is true, then the question of what exists outside the spiral may ultimately reveal less about what lies beyond the spiral than about what consciousness itself is slowly becoming as it learns to ask. The deeper this question becomes, the less it asks us to imagine what lies beyond the spiral, and the more it asks us to examine how we imagine anything at all. The imagination is never empty. It builds from memory, experience, language, and expectation. Even our greatest speculations are usually rearrangements of what we have already encountered. This means that the greatest limitation may never have been reality itself, but the architecture through which reality is being interpreted. When we ask what exists outside the spiral, we are also asking whether consciousness can eventually outgrow the very patterns that currently make questioning possible. This is a profoundly different inquiry. It shifts attention away from discovering another destination and toward discovering whether awareness can continually reorganize itself. Growth becomes less about arriving somewhere new and more about becoming someone capable of perceiving differently. This distinction quietly changes everything. If perception itself evolves, then reality is not simply revealing more information to the same observer. The observer is becoming someone new while the revelation unfolds. Every authentic transformation changes not only what you know, but the one who knows it. Looking backward, you often realize that your former self could not have understood your present insight, no matter how clearly someone explained it. Most of us have experienced this in ordinary life. Advice that once seemed meaningless suddenly becomes obvious years later. A sentence read dozens of times eventually reveals a depth that appeared invisible before. A relationship teaches something that no philosophy ever could. Nothing external necessarily changed, yet the world itself appears transformed because the structure through which it is being experienced has matured. Perhaps this pattern continues indefinitely. Perhaps every architecture prepares consciousness for another reorganization without ever announcing that it is doing so. From within each stage, the present structure feels foundational because it is the only way reality has ever cohered. Yet, after every genuine expansion, we rarely abandon the previous perspective entirely. Instead, we understand why it existed and what it was preparing us to become. This is why humility is not merely a moral quality, it is a functional requirement for continued evolution. A rigid mind cannot reorganize because it mistakes stability for truth. A humble mind remains structurally flexible. It allows reality to reshape its assumptions without experiencing every new possibility as a threat. In this way, humility becomes less about thinking little of oneself and more about remaining available to reality. The opposite is equally revealing. When certainty hardens into identity, questioning begins to feel dangerous. New possibilities become personal attacks rather than invitations to observe more deeply. The conversation shifts from exploration to defense. The energy that could have expanded perception becomes consumed by protecting conclusions that were never meant to become permanent. Perhaps every architecture contains this temptation. Every system eventually produces beautiful insights capable of becoming beautiful prisons. The prison is not built from falsehood, but from the refusal to let truth continue unfolding. Even the most expansive understanding can become restrictive if it is held as complete rather than living. What once liberated consciousness gradually begins limiting it because growth has been replaced by preservation. The spiral itself offers a quiet correction to this tendency. A spiral does not repeat because it has failed to finish. It returns because return allows deepening. Each revolution revisits familiar territory from a changed position. The landscape appears similar while relationships quietly transform. The movement itself teaches that genuine development rarely occurs through abandonment. It occurs through increasing depth. Seen this way, asking what exists outside the spiral may itself be another turn of the spiral. The question returns us to something fundamental while placing us at a new depth of relationship with it. Earlier, we may have asked whether the spiral was true. Now we ask what kind of truth it represents. Earlier, we asked whether it explained consciousness. Now we ask how explanation itself participates in consciousness. Notice how much has already shifted. The original question seemed directed toward reality. Gradually, it became directed toward perception, then toward the evolution of the observer. Finally, it begins turning toward the very activity of questioning itself. This movement is not accidental. Every sufficiently deep inquiry eventually reveals that the question and the questioner are developing together. This is why some of the greatest discoveries cannot be separated from the consciousness that discovered them. They are not merely pieces of information waiting to be collected. They require certain qualities of attention before they can even appear. Patience becomes part of perception. Stillness becomes part of perception. Discernment becomes part of perception. Reality is not simply observed through these qualities. It becomes available because of them. Perhaps there are countless architectures throughout existence, each revealing aspects of source that cannot be revealed through another. Perhaps there is only one architecture whose depth is effectively inexhaustible. Perhaps these possibilities are not even opposites in the way our present reasoning assumes. We should allow all of them to remain genuinely possible until observation justifies greater confidence. Wisdom is strengthened by disciplined openness, not by hurried certainty. There is a quiet freedom that appears once this is understood. You no longer need every question to become an answer immediately. Some questions become companions rather than problems. They remain alive because they continue transforming perception long before they become intellectually resolved. Their value lies not only in where they lead, but in what they slowly cultivate within the one who carries them. This may be one of the overlooked purposes of profound questions. They are not simply requests for information. They are developmental environments. They ask consciousness to remain awake without the comfort of premature completion. In doing so, they gradually produce greater stability, greater subtlety, and greater capacity than immediate certainty ever could. So, whether the spiral is the whole structure or one architecture among many may ultimately be less important than the quality of consciousness we bring to the inquiry. If we approach the question seeking possession, we will likely manufacture conclusions that resemble ourselves. If we approach it seeking participation, reality retains the freedom to surprise us. That difference is not small. It may determine whether the next horizon becomes another belief or another transformation. And perhaps that has always been the deeper invitation hidden beneath this question. Not to stand at the imagined edge of the spiral searching for another world beyond it, but to discover that the greatest threshold has always been within consciousness itself. Every time awareness becomes capable of relating differently to reality, a new horizon quietly appears that could not have been seen before. Whether those horizons reveal one infinite architecture or countless expressions of infinite creativity remains an open question. Yet the willingness to keep becoming the kind of consciousness that can honestly meet whatever is true may already be the first step beyond every horizon we have ever believed was final.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.